3 strands of hair changed the fate of an entire race. Galadriel, the most powerful elf in Middle-earth, the one who rejected the One Ring when even Gandalf feared to touch it, gave a gift so precious that Fëanor himself, the greatest craftsman who ever lived, begged for it and was refused. She gave it to a dwarf. Not just any gift, not just to any dwarf. This was Gimli, son of Glóin, who arrived in Lothlórien with prejudice carved into every word, who called the Golden Wood dangerous, who trusted elves about as far as he could throw them. And somehow, impossibly, this grumpy, axe-wielding dwarf became the only member of his entire race to set foot in the Undying Lands. Here's what makes this story extraordinary. Tolkien didn't write it as a footnote or an afterthought. He buried this detail so carefully in the appendices that most readers miss it entirely. But when you find it, when you trace the theological implications of what actually happened here, everything about dwarven fate, elven grace, and the nature of redemption itself gets rewritten. This is the story of how prejudice became enlightenment, how a gift of hair became a theological statement, and how Tolkien quietly inserted the most radical act of grace in his entire legendarium while no one was watching. Let's start with what Tolkien actually wrote, because I promise you're not ready for this. According to The Fellowship of the Ring, when the company prepares to leave Lothlórien, Galadriel asks each member what gift they desire. Most ask for practical things: elvish rope, a bow, a belt. Sensible requests from sensible people. Then she comes to Gimli, and Tolkien does something remarkable here. He gives us Gimli's exact words, and they're perfect. Gimli asks for nothing more than a single strand of her golden hair, which shall be treasured as a pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood until the end of days. Now here's where Tolkien gets sneaky. Galadriel doesn't give him 1 strand. She gives him 3. And she doesn't do it quietly or reluctantly. According to the text, she does it with a smile, saying his request goes beyond all rewards. Stop and think about what just happened there. This is Galadriel, the elven princess who watched empires rise and fall before the sun and moon existed. The same elf who survived the kinslaying, who witnessed the drowning of Númenor, who rejected the One Ring with power. Gandalf himself admitted he couldn't match. And she's moved by a dwarf's request. But wait, it gets better. According to Unfinished Tales, Fëanor, the elf who created the Silmarils, the greatest works of craft ever made, the guy whose entire personality was impossibly talented and knew it, once asked Galadriel for a strand of her hair. 3 times he asked. 3 times she refused. She remembered the greatest craftsman in elven history begging for her hair, and she turned him down because, and this is crucial, she perceived the dark desire in his heart. Fëanor wanted to possess, to capture light and hold it forever, consequence be damned. Gimli wanted to honor, to build a bridge between peoples, to treasure beauty without owning it. The absolute audacity of this choice. Tolkien just told us that a dwarf, a member of the race that Fëanor's people literally warred with over a necklace, had a purer heart than the greatest elf who ever lived, and Galadriel saw it. Now here's where things get properly cosmic, because Tolkien doesn't just leave this as a touching character moment. No, he follows the thread all the way to its impossible conclusion. According to The Return of the King appendices, those glorious footnotes where Tolkien hides his best material, after the War of the Ring ends and the Fourth Age begins, something unprecedented happens. Legolas builds a ship. Now on the surface, this isn't shocking. Elves sail west to Valinor all the time in Tolkien. It's practically tradition. When your time in Middle-earth ends, you book passage to the Blessed Realm and live in eternal paradise with the Valar. Standard elven retirement plan. It is said that Legolas took Gimli the dwarf with him because of their great friendship, greater than any that has been between elf and dwarf. Read that again, slowly. Legolas didn't just bring a friend along for company. He didn't sneak Gimli aboard as emotional support. According to Tolkien's own words, recorded in the official chronicles of Middle-earth, Gimli sailed to Valinor, a dwarf, to the Undying Lands, to the realm of the Valar themselves. This is where new readers usually think, okay, neat friendship story. And long-time readers start getting nervous because they know what this means. See? Valinor isn't just geographically distant, it's ontologically separate. After the fall of Numenor, Tolkien tells us the world was bent. The Undying Lands were removed from the physical sphere of the world entirely. You can't just sail there anymore. You need permission. Permission from the Valar. The same Valar who created the dwarves through Aula, but had to adopt them into the music of Ilúvatar after the fact. The same Valar who decreed that elves would go to Valinor, but dwarves would return to stone. According to the Silmarillion, when dwarves die, they believe they'll go to the halls of Aula, their maker, to work alongside him until the world's remaking. Not to Valinor, never to Valinor. That's not part of their fate. Here's what really bakes my noodle about this entire situation. Tolkien doesn't explain how this happened. He just drops it in the appendices like, oh, by the way, a dwarf went to heaven, and moves on. But when you trace the implications, when you follow what this means for everything Tolkien established about dwarven fate, Valar authority, and the nature of grace itself, this is either the most radical theological statement in the entire legendarium, or Tolkien forgot his own rules. And I can promise you, the man who revised the Silmarillion for 40 years, who tracked genealogies across millennia, who created 2 complete languages just to make place names accurate, did not forget his own rules. So what actually happened? Let's work through this systematically, because the answer is hidden in what Tolkien doesn't say. Gimli sails west with Legolas. This is canonical fact, stated explicitly. The Valar control access to Valinor after the world was bent. No one gets in without their permission. This is also canonical. Dwarves have never been to Valinor. Not one. Not ever. Even the greatest dwarf lords of the First Age, who fought beside elves against Morgoth himself, never received this honor. So the only way Gimli reaches Valinor is if the Valar themselves made an exception. But why? Why would they break their own rules for one dwarf? Here's where Galadriel enters the picture again, and suddenly everything clicks into place. According to the Silmarillion, Galadriel is one of the oldest elves in Middle-earth. She was born in Valinor during the Years of the Trees, before the sun and moon existed. She knew the Valar personally. She walked in their gardens, learned from them directly, lived among them for millennia. When she gives Gimli those 3 strands of hair, she's not just giving a gift. She's making a statement. Think about what she told him, that his request went beyond all rewards. Not, this is a nice gesture, or I appreciate the thought. She said this surpasses reward itself. And then, and this is the part that gives me chills, Tolkien connects it directly to Fëanor's request. The text explicitly says she remembered Fëanor's dark desire and recognized Gimli's purity by contrast. This isn't character development. This is prophecy. Galadriel, who possesses Nenya the Ring of Water, who has foresight that makes Gandalf nervous, who perceives hearts and intentions with perfect clarity, she sees something in Gimli that transcends the normal boundaries of race and fate. And I think, though Tolkien never states this explicitly because he's too subtle for that, Galadriel intervened with the Valar on Gimli's behalf. Not as a political favor, not as a reward for service during the War of the Ring, but as a theological argument about the nature of grace itself. Consider what Gimli represents: a dwarf who overcame centuries of inherited prejudice, who learned to see beauty in the elven way without abandoning his dwarven nature, who loved without possessing, who honored without demanding. The professor's own letters reveal he wrestled constantly with questions of predestination versus free will, of fate versus grace, of whether anyone could transcend their essential nature. And in Gimli he found his answer. Yes, dwarves were made differently than elves. Yes, they have different fates, different purposes, different roles in the music. But grace, true grace, transcends even the boundaries set by the Valar themselves. If a dwarf could become worthy not through changing what he is, but through perfecting who he chooses to be, then the Valar themselves would recognize that. But here's the beautiful part. None of this happens without Legolas. And I mean that literally. Tolkien specifically tells us, Gimli went to Valinor because of their great friendship, not despite it. Not in addition to it. Because of it. This is peak Tolkien. Brilliant and slightly unhinged in equal measure, because he's embedded an entire theology of redemption in a friendship. Think about where these two started. According to the Fellowship of the Ring, when Gimli and Legolas first meet at the Council of Elrond, there's approximately zero warmth between them. Legolas is diplomatically cold. Gimli is openly hostile. They represent their peoples perfectly. Elves and dwarves have been side-eyeing each other since the First Age. The history here runs deep. As the Silmarillion details, dwarves and elves first clashed over the Naudlamir, that cursed necklace that held a Silmaril. Dwarves killed an elven king over it. Elves destroyed dwarf strongholds in retaliation. Entire kingdoms fell because neither side could let the insult pass. By the Third Age, when Gimli and Legolas meet, they're carrying millennia of grudges they didn't personally experience but inherited anyway. Classic Tolkien, making history itself a character in the story. Then they walk through Moria together. And something shifts. Not immediately. Tolkien's too honest for instant transformation. But gradually, through shared danger and mutual respect, these two begin to see each other. Not as elf and dwarf, as Legolas and Gimli. The turning point, though? That's Lothlorien. According to the text, Legolas brings Gimli into the Golden Wood, not as a prisoner, but as a companion. He vouches for him. He stands beside him when other elves mutter about allowing a dwarf into their sacred realm. And Gimli, who arrived expecting treachery, who came armed with prejudice sharper than his axe, meets Galadriel. The text gives us his exact reaction. He looks into her eyes and sees neither the threat he expected nor the cold perfection he feared. He sees grace, and it breaks him. In the best possible way. That's when he asks for the hair. That's when centuries of inherited hatred crack open, and something new grows in the gap. But here's what I love about Tolkien's handling of this. He doesn't make it one-sided. After Lothlorien, we get that beautiful sequence where Legolas and Gimli travel through Rohan, through Gondor, through every major location in the War of the Ring, and they're competing. Who can kill more orcs? Who can find more beauty in the caves or the trees? Who can outstubborn the other during those endless marches? They don't stop being dwarf and elf. They don't transcend their natures or abandon their people's values. They just add each other to those values. Which is why, stay with me here because this part is crucial. When Legolas builds his ship and prepares to sail west, he doesn't ask permission to bring Gimli along. According to Tolkien's account, Legolas simply takes Gimli. As if there was never any question. As if friendship itself was sufficient authority. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, the Valar agree. That's not just character development. That's a complete rewriting of cosmic law based on the argument that love itself is more fundamental than fate. Only Tolkien would hide that in a footnote. Now here's the question that keeps me up at night. Why Gimli? Not, why was he worthy? We've covered that. But why was he the only dwarf ever to receive this grace? The First Age had dwarf lords who fought beside elves against Morgoth himself. A Zaghal of Belagost wounded Glaurung, the father of dragons, and bought the elves time to escape the Nirnaeth Arnuediad. That's the kind of heroism that should earn cosmic recognition. The Second Age had dwarf craftsmen who built Khazad-dûm into the greatest underground kingdom ever conceived. They mined mithril. They forged wonders that made elves jealous. But none of them went to Valinor. Even in the Third Age, before Gimli, there were dwarves of great renown. Thorin Oakenshield reclaimed Erebor. Dain Ironfoot died defending Dale. These were kings we're talking about. Still, none of them received what Gimli received. Here's what I think Tolkien is telling us, though he never states it explicitly because he trusts us to figure it out. Grace isn't earned. That's the point. That's the whole point. All those other dwarves were heroes. They were noble, brave, worthy of songs and honor, but they remained within their category. They were great dwarves, perfect exemplars of dwarvenness. Gimli did something different. He didn't transcend being a dwarf. Again, Tolkien never asks anyone to abandon their nature, but he added to it. He took the dwarven capacity for loyalty, for craftsmanship, for stubborn determination, and he opened it. To beauty he didn't understand initially, to friendship that defied history, to grace he never expected. The other dwarves were complete. Gimli was transformed. And that transformation, that willingness to be changed by encounter with something other, that's what the Valar recognized. Not his deeds, though they were worthy. Not his courage, though it was real. But his openness. Here's the really beautiful insanity of Tolkien's vision. The greatest gift a dwarf could receive was given to the dwarf who stopped demanding gifts and started treasuring what was freely given. Galadriel's hair wasn't powerful. It didn't grant Gimli magic or strength or foresight. It's just hair. But Gimli treasured it because it represented the relationship that made it possible. The moment when an elven queen looked at a dwarf and saw not a category, but a person. And that's what got him to Valinor. Not the hair itself, not the friendship alone, but what both of those things meant, that grace could break boundaries, even the Valar themselves had set. Every other dwarf tried to be the best dwarf. Gimli stopped trying and simply became himself, which turned out to be more than anyone expected. So here we are, back where we started. 3 strands of hair that changed everything. But now you understand what Tolkien actually did here. He took the race. Everyone dismissed, including his own elves, including his own Valar in a sense, and he showed that redemption isn't about being different. It's about being more fully yourself than you ever imagined possible. Gimli didn't stop being a dwarf to reach Valinor. He became the most dwarf-like dwarf imaginable, loyal to the point of sailing into the unknown, stubborn enough to demand the Valar accept him, treasure-minded enough to value friendship above kingdoms. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. More than enough was everything. This is Tolkien at his most brilliantly peculiar, hiding the most radical statement about grace and transformation in the appendices, letting most readers miss it entirely, trusting that those who found it would understand what it meant. What it means is this: no one is locked into their fate by their nature. No boundary is so fundamental that grace cannot cross it. No prejudice is so old that friendship cannot overcome it. But, and here's the catch that makes it honest, transformation costs. It cost Gimli his certainty, his comfortable prejudices, his place in the neat categories his people had built. It cost Legolas his solitude, his elven superiority, his chance to sail west without complication. It cost Galadriel nothing, because she'd already paid the price of wisdom and knew that the only thing worth keeping is what you're willing to give away. And it cost the Valar themselves something too, the tidiness of their original design. Because once you let one dwarf into Valinor, you've admitted that the categories aren't absolute, that the music of Iluvatar is still being composed. That grace is more fundamental than fate. Tolkien, bless him, knew this would bother people. Knew it would raise questions he'd never answer. Knew readers would wrestle with the implications for decades. And he did it anyway. Because at the end of the day, After all the languages and maps and genealogies, after the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings and 40 years of revision, Tolkien believed in grace more than he believed in categories. He believed that a dwarf with an open heart mattered more than an elf with a pure bloodline. He believed that friendship could rewrite cosmic law. And he believed that the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't power or knowledge or immortality. It was recognition. The simple act of seeing them, truly seeing them, as they actually are, not as their category suggests they should be. That's what Galadriel gave Gimli. That's what Gimli gave back to all dwarves who come after. And that's what Tolkien gives to us. A mythology where grace always has the final word, where transformation is always possible, and where the most radical act you can commit is to see past categories and love what's actually there. 3 strands of hair, an impossible friendship, and the only dwarf who ever reached the Undying Lands. Not because he earned it, but because grace, true grace, doesn't wait to be earned. It just is, and in Tolkien's hands, that's the most beautiful thing imaginable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.